This is part 2 of a 3-part podcast talking about my personal anchor points for faith when shadows are all around. I hope some of them are helpful to you and you can incorporate them into how you view the world. Last time we talked about how absolute certainty in life is a mirage, but despite that there is a place for rational argument for God. We talked about belief in God being worth the gamble amongst the alternatives. This week we will talk about the place of Jesus and personal experience as well as other ways to build a worldview that can sustain us through shadow times. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Jools. Welcome to Dechurched.com. It's often said that in Western culture, church is a bit on the nose. But Jesus, people kind of like. I suspect that's a particular version of Jesus that people have. The one who was kind to animals and small children and told us to love one another. But of course, he was so much more than a nice guy telling people to be good to one another. Nobody gets crucified for doing that. So think about Jesus for a moment. For me, Jesus is actually the most likely option for meaning in this life. It's my best guess. I've studied other religions and atheists and atheism and great leaders and philosophy, and I keep coming back to Jesus. I don't see anyone who can compare to him. He's magnificently strong in his character. He knew what to say to unwrap the inner workings of people's lives, and yet he was gentle and kind with those who were most vulnerable. He was wise enough to confront and confound the greatest minds, and yet simple enough to be understood by the uneducated. He was uncompromising with hypocrisy, and yet he was loving to the nth degree. He's enigmatic at times, even odd, but overall I see in him glimpses of who I want to be, and in a way that no one else in history is. And so I say to myself in shadow times, if I could hang out with someone like that, what couldn't I become? Think about it. How do we acquire good traits? The answer is we hang out with people who have those traits. I hang out with those who are loving and kind. And if I want to be infinitely loving, I need to hang out with a sort of person that is like that, in the hope that their traits will rub off on me. And I don't know anyone who quite fits that bill like Jesus. Ultimately, it is a choice, but I ask myself, where else and to whom else could I go? My own apathetic ego would have me passively drift along with this gift that is called my life. But when I gaze at Jesus, he picks me up, he dusts me down and says, now start walking and learn to live fully with me. Take my yoke upon you. A bunch of the crowds were leaving Jesus, and he turned to the disciples and said, are you going to leave me too? And the disciples said, no, you have the words of eternal life. To whom else can we go? In the shadow times I talk to Jesus, I rage at God sometimes. I know that he's big enough to cope with that. But I also remind myself of Jesus' character, his love and his welcome. And slowly as I dwell upon that, very slowly, I find myself more at peace and more whole. Not always because I have answers, but like Job, eventually it becomes just a matter of learning contentment. I look at Jesus and it's kind of okay. Like Thomas, who didn't need to touch the wounds of Jesus when he saw him, he was like, okay, that's good enough for me. To encounter even in the slightest inkling is better than having answers. I will never have all my questions answered, and at times I will continue to strive and ask and wrestle with discontentment. I'm often unhappy at not being God and knowing everything, but this calming presence of Jesus centers me if I let it. So this is one of my go-to spaces in shadowy times. It's a slow learn for me, but so vital. So what am I saying? One of my reference points is this: Jesus is my best guess amongst all available options. He exceeds them all, not only because of who he was, but who he continues to be in my journey. And that leads me on to another reference point, which is this: experiences. I wonder if you have ever had a strange experience that your first reaction to was, whoa, that was spooky. It felt like a God thing, supernatural, but I'm not quite sure. And maybe your intuitive reaction was that, but immediately you dismissed it as just unusual. Probably a Western worldview breaking through there, but that's another story. Sometimes we shouldn't dismiss such experiences. All experience is, of course, subjective. But that is not to say it is without meaning. And noticing such moments and treasuring them in your heart, as it was said of Mary, can be helpful for those shadowy times. What sort of experiences? Well, sometimes they're very powerful. As a teenager, I remember being overwhelmed with a sense of love for Jesus. My whole body was literally shaking. Or in my 20s, I was walking through the borders in Scotland and talking with God, and I had a kind of waking dream of a significant event that only occurred the following day when it appeared on the news. It was almost like God was saying, this is what my voice sounds like when you really seek me. I had an instinct about some issues going on in the life of a visitor to our congregation on one occasion, which proved to be correct. I've had a number of other events throughout the decades of my life, each of which I can explain away rationally, but the accumulation of them says to me there is more to life and more to my life than just what science can analyze. So experiences can sometimes be powerful. I wonder if you've had any that you've maybe in the past dismissed. More often though, experience is about glimpses, a significant dream that feels like it's more than just my psyche, a sense of synchronicity and timing in the phone call or comment by a friend, a moment of connectedness when walking through a forest. These things are worth noting and nurturing when the sun is still shining and you're not in the valley of shadows. And of course, the shadows themselves can be evidence of the reality of God. Darkness itself can ironically indicate that there is still light somewhere. More on this a little later. So my point in this is, let's build a suite of things that makes our worldview. These things will sustain us in shadowy times. They're like a toolkit. One tool is helpful on one occasion, another time, another tool. Or like a mosaic perhaps, comprised of pieces that make up the way we see the world. Not perfect because we always see in part, but good enough to help us keep walking in the valley of shadows. And even flickering candles can light a vast cathedral. Next time in our final of these 3 podcasts, we will look at appetite and community and the part they play in keeping walking with Jesus in shadowy times. In the meantime, I want to say thanks for listening. Join us on our Facebook page and don't forget to like this podcast. My name's Jools. This is Dechurched.com.